Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Albert Arena, director of the Waltham Museum, a museum whose collection is on the history of Waltham. As part of our program, we have 16 historical slideshows on Waltham, and the one we have for you today is the military history of Waltham. We'll go back to 1630 when Waltham was founded, travel through the years, and talk about the 9 or 10 wars that America was in. And we'll tell about the role that Waltham played in these wars, which was significant. When the settlers first came to Waltham in 1630, well, it wasn't Waltham until 1738, but when they came here in 1630, there were Indians living on the north bank of the Charles River. This tribe was known as the Quinoban tribe. There were also Indians up around Hardy Pond and north side of Prospect Hill, a section of the Algonquin tribe. Well, the first incident with the Indians that's recorded in Waltham's history books is with an Indian named Cutsummock. He wanted a rifle, and the rules of the Puritans were that no Puritan was to trade or sell a rifle to an Indian. But he managed to convince Tom Hawkins to trade his rifle for some furs. When the town fathers heard about this trade, they were furious. They punished Tom Hawkins. They whipped him at a post, and they branded his cheek. They also got to Cutsummock, took the rifle away from him, gave him his furs back. The next incident, which is our first recorded war in America, was caused by a man from Waltham, the murder of John Oldham. John Oldham was the first person in Waltham that was granted land. He was granted 500 acres in the Mount Feek area of Waltham in 1636. Now, Oldham was a trader, he was a hunter, and he was also a representative on the council of the town. And when he was trading with the Pequot Indians in Block Island, the Narragansett Indians were furious, and he was killed by one of these Indian tribes, and his head was cut off. But that set off a war between the Pequot Indian tribe and the Narragansett Indian tribe, with the Puritans fighting alongside the Narragansett Indian tribe, and they almost wiped out the Pequot Indians. It's the first recorded war in American history, started by a Waltham man. Now, this is Mount Feek Cemetery, and early plans of Mount Feek Cemetery. It shows the large 500 acres that was granted to John Oldham back in 1636, and the war which he caused in 1640 with the Pequot Indians. Now, there were other incidents throughout New England during those Puritan days between 1630 and 1677 called the King Philip's Wars. And there's no other recorded direct incident with Waltham, but the militia, which a section of it came from Waltham, did participate in these skirmishes. The next war was the French and Indian War in 1746, and a group of Waltham men went up to Cape Breton Island as part of a militia force to fight in that particular war. As you remember, the French and the Indians were fighting the British and the colonialists, and the British and the colonialists won that war. Otherwise, this area would have been controlled by the French. Now, a lot of this history is coming from a book written on the history of the 182nd Infantry, a history that goes back 300 years. And in this book, you'll see charts like this, which explains, for instance, the King Philip's War, the Pequot War, the Cape Breton expedition during the French and Indian War, and then, of course, the big one, the Revolutionary War. And the name of the citizen soldiers kept changing. First, it was the charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony Train Bands. Then it was the North Regiment, the Regiment of Middlesex, the Lower Regiment of Middlesex, the 1st Regiment of Militia. And during the Revolutionary War was the 1st Middlesex County Regiment of Massachusetts under Colonel Thomas Gardner. Now, there are 5 connections between the Revolutionary War and Waltham. The first one, was during the Battle of Lexington and Concord. As you remember, the British were going out to Concord to confiscate the arms in Concord by way of Lexington. And of course, they gave the signal, one if by land, two if by sea, and Paul Revere gave the warning to all villages and towns. Well, the warning was also given to Waltham, and all the Minutemen of Waltham got together at this point on Piety Corner, the corner of Lincoln Street and Lexington Street. And it was a key spot because they weren't sure what they were going to do, whether they go to Lexington and help the Minutemen Lexington fight the British, or go to Concord, or stay here, because the word was that after the British confiscated the arms in Concord, they're going to double back through the village of Waltham and burn the town, because Waltham had a reputation of a number of rebels, instigators in earlier years. They had this tavern on Main Street where they used to meet, and they even stored arms there. And this was in 1775. But in January of 1775, the arms were moved from Waltham to Concord, along with other arms. So chances are, if they didn't move the arms from Waltham to Concord, the British might have very well come to Waltham to start the Revolutionary War. But as it was, hustlers were going back and forth, delivering messages to see what the British route was going to be. And then when they learned that the British were returning to Boston at the same route that they came, all the Minutemen from Waltham went to Lexington to help fight the British on their way back to Boston. Now, 3 months later was the Battle of Bunker Hill, and Colonel Thomas Gardner took the company of Waltham men, namely led by Captain Abijah Childs, to Bunker Hill. And they fought valiantly at Bunker Hill, and Colonel Thomas Gardner was killed at Bunker Hill. Another group under Colonel Jonathan Brewer, who lived on the site of the Gore estate — the Gore estate wasn't built at that time — but he led another group of fighters, separate from the one we just mentioned, and he fought valiantly at Bunker Hill also. And Thomas Brewer was wounded at Bunker Hill, but he recovered from his wounds. Both Thomas Brewer and Captain Abijah Childs of Waltham, plus other Minutemen, would later join George Washington throughout the entire Revolutionary War in New York, fighting in New York and New Jersey. Because long about June, July 1775, George Washington came up from Virginia, passed right through Waltham to Cambridge to take charge of the Patriot Army. And his first mission, as being in charge of the Patriot Army, was to get the British to evacuate Boston. In doing so, he ordered his friend General Henry Knox to get the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in New York and take them to Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston. And General Knox did that with oxen and oxen teams. And the teams marched through 200 miles, and of course they had to go through Waltham. And this monument outside of Banks School says, "Through this place passed General Henry Knox in the winter of 1775 to 1776 to deliver to General George Washington at Cambridge the train of artillery from Fort Ticonderoga used to force the British to evacuate Boston." And finally, after the Revolutionary War was over, after the British surrendered at Yorktown, one of the British generals, General Burgoyne, was being taken back to Boston to be shipped to England. And they came back up the Grand Way, which is now Main Street, Route 20, and they camped here at this tree. And for years it was a tourist attraction called the Burgoyne tree in Waltham. And it was taken down about 100 years ago, but for those of you who would like to know where that site is, that's where McDonald's restaurant is today. Now, still outside the Banks School is another monument which declares the road that George Washington took from Virginia to Cambridge as the George Washington Memorial Highway. And then at the northeast corner of City Hall is a monument, and it lists all the men, most of the men, who fought during the Revolutionary War, all those from Waltham who fought during the Revolutionary War, like Jonathan Brewer, Captain Abijah Childs, and others. And they're all buried at the Grove Hill Cemetery. It's a fine place to visit if you haven't been there. Very historical site between Main Street and Grove Street. This particular one is Jonathan Dix, one of the Minutemen of Waltham. The next war to come up was the War of 1812, and that was 35 years later. And the British invaded Washington, D.C. They burned the Capitol and forced President Madison to evacuate Washington, D.C. But up here in Waltham, Francis Cabot Lowell was starting the first mill in the United States and starting the Industrial Revolution. Now, you might not think there's a connection, but that's what the war was all about. Although we had won our independence as people in the Revolutionary War, we didn't have our independence as far as producing material things, and the British wanted to keep us from doing that. But Francis Cabot Lowell started Mill Number 1, the Boston Manufacturing Company, in 1813, right in the middle of the War of 1812, and that was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and set us on to freedom from other countries for material goods. Now, 4 years after the War of 1812, Nathaniel P. Banks was born in Waltham, 1916. In 1954, he was elected governor of Massachusetts. This picture came from the front page of a Harper's magazine in 1854, excuse me. And he was elected the governor of Massachusetts, governor-elect here. And he was also instrumental in starting the Republican Party. The Republican Party started around 1856, and he was friendly with Abraham Lincoln, and he helped Abraham Lincoln get elected in 1860. Shortly after Abraham Lincoln was elected, the Civil War occurred. And Abraham Lincoln, since he knew Nathaniel P. Banks, asked him to become a major general in the Union Army, which Nathaniel Banks accepted. And there he is, Nathaniel P. Banks, a major general in the Union Army. And he was assigned to a very important position in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. Major General McClellan was on the coast by the Potomac River protecting Washington, and Major General John C. Fremont was out west, and Major General Butler was down in Louisiana, that section of Louisiana, which was under Union control. But there we have Major General Nathaniel P. Banks from Waltham, Mass. He lived on Main Street. He was born on River Street, but he lived on Main Street at this time, close to where Banks Square is today. His house is still standing. That's his wife and his 3 children during the Civil War. Now, as I said, he was assigned to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And this is a Peninsula Campaign map of March to May 1862. As you can see, Washington's on the right, the capital of Washington. Major General McClellan was assigned to the Army in that area. But in the center is the Shenandoah Valley, and unfortunately, his opponent was probably the greatest general of the Civil War, Stonewall Jackson. So the first 4 battles he had with Stonewall Jackson, he lost all of them. It wasn't disgraceful losses, but they were losses. He lost at Kerrstown in March of 23. He lost at Harper's Ferry. He lost at Front Royal and Winchester. Jackson was a very shrewd and professional general, and Banks, of course, was just the former governor of Massachusetts, trying to do his best. He fought valiantly as men fought valiantly. And this is a general view of how they fought during the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley and other places, Antietam and Vicksburg and Fredericksburg, and also, like I say, in the Shenandoah Valley. Very horrible war. But the last encounter between General Banks and Stonewall Jackson was won by General Banks. It was an unusual one because in all the other encounters, General Banks outnumbered Stonewall Jackson. But in the Battle of Cedar Mountain in August 1862, General Banks had 12,000 men to Stonewall Jackson's 28,000. So Stonewall Jackson never dreamt that General Banks would attack him. So he went away from the front for a while. And General Banks, with his 12,000 men, attacked Stonewall Jackson's forces at Cedar Mountain and caught them off guard. And it was a rout. They were retreating in uncontrolled fashion until Stonewall Jackson could rally his troops together and push General Banks back. But it was sort of a draw, but it was a moral victory for General Nathaniel Banks over Stonewall Jackson. Now, at this point, General Banks was reassigned to take over the military governorship of Louisiana. And he left the Shenandoah Valley, got on some ships with Admiral Porter with 10,000 of his men, and they landed at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And this is General Banks landing his force at Baton Rouge, Louisiana in December of 1862 to take charge of the captured portion of Louisiana. Now, his first assignment was to attack Port Hudson on the Mississippi River, because the Confederates were still in control of the Mississippi River. And General Grant at the north was attacking Vicksburg, and General Banks was attacking Port Hudson. Well, Grant took Vicksburg, but still the Mississippi was under control of the Confederates. And then General Banks took Port Hudson, the last stronghold of the Confederates, which split the Confederacy in two. So all the history books will tell you that General Banks took the last stronghold in Mississippi and split the Confederacy in two. This is Confederates at Port Hudson undergoing the assault from General Banks' forces. And this caption says, "Saluting the flag at Port Hudson." That's the Union flag is being raised over Port Hudson as General Banks took this city and split the Confederacy in two. The next mission for General Banks was to neutralize the coast between Mexico and Louisiana. So with Admiral Porter, the fleet landed at Brownsville, Texas, right at the tip of Texas, right where it meets Mexico. And here we see the Confederate troops, evacuating Brownsville, Texas, in preparation of the invasion by General Banks' forces. Finally, Brownsville, Texas, occupied by the army of General Banks, November of 1863. Now, if you go down there today, you'll see this sign at Port Isabel. That's the port of Point Isabel. That's right next to Brownsville. And in the last paragraph of this sign, which is there right now, it says, "In November 1863, U.S. forces from the expedition of General Nathaniel P. Banks occupied Point Isabel. The blockade which the Union was conducting over this port was lifted, and the port was reactivated." A second invasion, along with this invasion, was further up the coast by a portion of Admiral Porter and General Banks' army at Brazos, Santiago. But anyway, after he captured Brownsville, he marched back to Louisiana along the coast, neutralizing that coast. But as soon as he left the area, the Confederates would move back in a small way. Now, at this point, things were going very well. He wanted his forces to aim towards Mobile, Alabama. General Banks wanted his forces to head towards Atlanta, Georgia, and McClellan was going to take Richmond and come down the coast. That was the plan they all agreed to. But he was countermanded by General Chief and Staff in Washington, D.C., Halleck, to not go to Mobile at first, but to go up the Red River the opposite way and neutralize a Confederate force up in the wooded area of northern Louisiana. Well, it was against General Banks' wishes to do this because he didn't think it was a good idea. But being a loyal soldier as he was, he took his forces up the Red River. And along with that, Admiral Porter sailed his fleet up the Red River to provide gunship support. And the river proved to be dried up, so the gunships couldn't support him all the way. That, by the way, was his forces leaving to go on this Red River campaign. This is Admiral Porter's fleet on the Red River, an attack at Sabine Pass. General Banks, to carry out his orders, continued on without Admiral Porter's backing, and the Confederates caught him real good and beat him pretty badly in the Red River battles, forced him to retreat all the way back to the center of Louisiana. And General Halleck was furious because he lost, and General Banks was replaced by General Granby. Later on, General Grant would say that it wasn't really General Banks' fault, but for a number of years the books blamed General Banks because they didn't know the whole story. So General Banks was relieved of his command by General Granby, and he returned back to Waltham. He got elected to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., where he remained the rest of his life as a representative and Speaker of the House of Representatives. He's in this group right here. He's always proud of his uniform, always wearing it to military functions. And then on September 1st, 1894, he died. He was waked at Asbury Temple, which is right there close to Central Square in Waltham, and he was buried at Grove Hill Cemetery, same cemetery the Revolutionary War people are buried at. But it was one of Waltham's largest funeral, with caissons, a horse without a rider, and he was buried at Mount Feig Cemetery, which is on that area close to Grove Hill Cemetery, which is close to Grove Street. There's his grave. You want to visit if you can. The Revolutionary War dead are buried at the other end of this cemetery, and General Banks is buried on the Grove Street side of the Grove Hill Cemetery. Of course, his statue was put up in Boston in 1907, given to Waltham 35 years ago, and now stands at Waltham Common. Other people from Waltham who were in the Civil War was Private George Maynard. The thing about him, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest award. He won it at Fredericksburg when he returned to the front lines under severe fire and carried a wounded and helpless comrade to a place of safety. This is George Maynard, became a major later on, and the only Congressional Medal of Honor winner in the history of Waltham. He's buried at Mount Feig Cemetery. That's his grave. And then there were the Brown brothers. George Brown and his brother Charles Brown, both from Waltham. They were both killed at Gettysburg, 1863, a very unusual occurrence. Also at the grave site at Nathaniel P. Banks is his three brothers. His brother, Lieutenant Hiram B. Banks, was killed at the Second Battle of Bull Run. William Banks, his brother, died of natural causes, but Colonel Gardner Banks led the 16th Regiment of Massachusetts, and that was an interesting battle he led. It was in Fair Oaks, Virginia, and the newspaper account went something like this: the charge of the gallant 16th. Waltham has since the commencement of this deplorable struggle been unusually favored in its escape from war casualties. While other towns in the state have had some sons stricken down in the field, our town has been spared, but the blow has fallen at last and heavily. The 16th Massachusetts was selected to make the exploration of the enemy's strength at Fair Oaks, which was northeast of Richmond. And on account of was as follows: we were out in front of the army of which we were a part, for the first time knowing we should fight within an hour. Not only our personal reputations were at stake, but the reputation of the different towns from which each company was sent, the reputation of the 16th, and finally the reputation of our noble state. The party I was in had just waded through a piece of water waist deep when a sharp, quick volley of musketry was heard, and the bullets splattered through the leaves in the most unceremonious manner. We stood still a moment and then crept or ran forward and got behind the largest trees and fired our rifles into the woods. Then came volley after volley. Now this is the Union Army returning after that battle at Fair Oaks. And it goes on like this. As the different companies came in, the rolls were called. Lyman Fields, Jr. of Company H and Robert Sherman of Company K, both of Waltham, were known to be almost instantly killed while bravely advancing towards the enemy. Lieutenant F.P.H. Rogers, so well and favorably known to all Waltham people, was known to be the most severely wounded in the body while gallantly advancing right into the eyes of the rebel rifle pits. He exclaimed to one of his men who was close by him at the time, "I'm killed," and fell. George H. Robinson of Company H received severe wounds in the leg. He returned to our tents, sorrowful and sad for those who have fallen, yet proud to be made to believe that in its first fight, the 16th Massachusetts showed no signs of faltering. That was in June 18, 1862. Well, anyway, the war's long gone. Men are buried. This is the plot up in Mount Feig Cemetery of all the Civil War veterans from Waltham who were killed or died. And once again, if you haven't visited these areas, you should visit these areas. Up on Waltham Common is the Civil War Memorial, listing the 53 men from Waltham killed during the Civil War, including Hiram Banks and F.P.H. Rogers. Also up at the Waltham Common is the Spanish-American War Monument. We'll talk about that one now. That monument was put up October 21st, 1928 in the ceremony to remember the soldiers, sailors, and Marines that participated in the Spanish-American War. And behind the monument list all the men who participated in that war, including men like Felix Jeffreys and Andrew Holmes. In the military room at the Waltham Museum, we have a list of the Company F men who participated in that war, and we also have a list of all the men from Waltham who participated in that war, such as Henry Smith. This is the type of uniforms they had in 1898. That's Master Sergeant Henry Smith, and you might notice his medals on his chest. The medals are now in the military room at the Waltham Museum. After the war, the men were very proud of the war, and they formed the Prospect Club. They used to meet up at Prospect Hill, do some camping and hunting, talk about the war, talk about the charges up San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt and such, and had a very good time. They're a very proud group. They marched in the parades. Here's one of the last parades they marched in 1950, that's Andrew Holmes there in the center with the special type of hat on, one of the last Spanish-American War veterans at that time. The next incident that involved Company F and some other military people was a Mexican border incident with Pancho Villa in 1916. They federalized Company F of the Massachusetts National Guard. They sent them down to fight Pancho Villa on the Mexican border. And this little thing here is one of the soldiers sent back to his girlfriend greetings from the Mexican border, and it's about the farewell that they had when he left. It was a short incursion, and they soon returned to Waltham because World War I was heating up. The Germans had sunk the Lusitania. And in April of 1917, the House of Representatives declared war on Germany by a vote of 373 to 50. $3 billion was asked for the army of $1 million to be mobilized, and as well as the nation's gigantic resources. And once again, Company F was called out to participate in this war. That's the army on Sharon Street with Company F and the National Guard trained. At that time, they were known as the 5th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia. And when they were federalized, they trained for 3 weeks on Bicycle Park. And this is the photo they took of the entire contingent of Company F. In the center is Captain Brown with the dog under his left arm. Towards his left arm is Lieutenant Arthur Hanson, the hero of World War I, who would become mayor of Waltham. And on his right arm is Lieutenant Moyes. But they trained there for 3 weeks, and it was quite a thing. They set up their camps on the baseball diamonds. They'd perform their drills in front of their families, their wives and kids, and mothers would be looking on. They'd be proud to perform in front of their families. This was the mess hall. Children would come and watch them eat and cook. One acquaintance we know, she was 9 years old at the time, Marjorie Shakespeare, who lived on Shakespeare Road. She still tells us about how she was 9 years old watching the troops maneuver on Bicycle Park, which, by the way, they call Camp Banks after Nathaniel P. Banks. They'd go home at night, visit their families. Some of these soldiers we don't quite know. If anyone knows this soldier, they can tell us, from World War I. The song at the time was popular by Irving Berlin was "Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning." And like I say, the wives and the girlfriends would come down to the camps during the breaks, talk with their soldiers. They'd take pictures, visit their girlfriends. Very proud to be a member of the Army of the United States. He's still not, he's a soldier. He doesn't look too happy. Apparently his girlfriend or his mother gave him a sweater I don't think he's crazy about. But they came from other walks of life. It wasn't just the National Guard that would fight in World War I. They came from the streets of Waltham, such as Joe Kelly here of Waltham in World War I. Now Joe, here we see him as a young boy sitting with his brother John Kelly, with his brother Joe Kelly. And they trained at Camp Devens as opposed to training on Camp Banks in Waltham. And there's a group of Waltham men training at Camp Devens around 1917. Notice that apparently they had a woman to do their laundry, it appears from this picture. But the cavalry was big in World War I. There was a lot of cavalry training, as you can see here. There's another World War I veteran who buried in Waltham. And once again, we refer back to the history of the 182nd Infantry. And as you can see, we talked about the Spanish-American War, the Mexican Border War, World War I, and other incidents where the 5th Regiment, 5th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia, participated. Anyway, when this group finally got over to France, this is the area that they would be fighting at. At this time, I'd like to give a little detail on it. On August 17, 1917, about 3 weeks later, the company was transferred to Framingham. From here, 132 of them were shipped to St. Nazaire, France on September 24th by way of Hoboken, New Jersey. When the group arrived in France, they were transferred from the 5th Regiment to the 101st Infantry, 51st Brigade, 26th Division. After 5 months of intensive training, the 101st entered the trenches of Chemins-des-Dames on February 5, 1918, and engaged the Germans for the first time on February 23rd. Company F received more Distinguished Service Crosses than any other outfit in the 101st. There were 103 citations for extreme bravery. Fritz Hedlund of Waltham won the highest honor that the French government gave, which is equivalent to the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was also one of many men from Waltham to receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award in the United States history. The 101st Division was also known as the Yankee Division, part of the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force. Well, we won't go into all the details, but this is where all the battles took place, and they did themselves well. And this is the way they fought during World War I, charging through barbed wire. And this was the hero of World War I, Lieutenant Arthur Hanson, who was made the captain of the Company F during battle because the other captain was wounded. But his orders from the other captain who was wounded said the command is to go forward, and he did. Did himself very well during World War I. As I said, he later became mayor of Waltham. Now, of course, the newspapers back home carried stories of these events. For instance, this newspaper in October of 1918 tells about Lieutenant Hanson on the third column is given his double bars, meaning that he was made the captain of the Union. That's his picture there. To the left of Colonel Captain Hanson is a story about Private Ed Trudeau, severely wounded in France, and he would be home in about 2 weeks. Another interesting story is the one on the left. It says, may not use tents put up for a hospital. What was happening, there was an influenza epidemic going on during October, November, December of 1918. It was sweeping Waltham. And they set up some outdoor tents up there off Lexington Street where the high school is today. And they were bringing the influenza patients there. One of the drivers who we still know, an ambulance driver, his name is Alan Pierce. He's 92 years old. He tells about those days when he was an ambulance driver for influenza patients during 1918. Alan Pierce, by the way, also did police duty during the policeman's strike many years ago in Boston. Here's another newspaper clipping. Men from Waltham who participated in the war. George Greenway, John Malloy, Ed Littleback, and Savella. Now, it wasn't just men that did well for America in the war. A 1911 graduate of Waltham Training School for Nurses joined the Red Cross, and she was in the front lines, the field hospitals, front lines of France and English soldiers that were wounded. She took care of them. But more important, before she went to the wars, she posed for a poster, recruiting poster for World War I. And it's a very well-known poster. You might see it someday by collectors of World War I. And it was posed by Eleanor Greggs, a 1911 graduate of Waltham Training School for Nurses. This plane was the de Havilland DH-4. 1,000 of these were made at the old Metz plant during World War I. And they also made 108 Hadley Page airplanes for the war effort in 1918. The armistice was over. The war ended November 11th, 1918, and the armistice was signed. And there was one lady, a girl, 17 years old. She was so excited by the war ending that she wrote this on the very same day that the war ended. She was 17 years old, and her name was Dorothy Smith. And she wrote, I feel that I must sit down and express my feelings while I yet feel a glow of fervent patriotism. That is what it is, and what is inspiring all Waltham today. At 4:45 this morning, we were awakened by the fire alarms. It rang 3 sevens, and a military call which had been the agreed signal for Peace Day. Almost immediately, people began to be heard upon the streets. In half an hour, the military call was again sounded 3 times, and the watch factory bell began to ring. So did various other bells. Knowing that it was useless to attempt any more sleep, we arose, and I quickly dressed and hurried out. This was 5:50 a.m., and I took a horn and blew it at Grandma, who was in bed, and at Grandpa, who was not in bed. Then I went up to Moody Street. She lived on Chester Street. Everywhere flags were being hung out, and a great number of people were out in the street. I neglected to mention that the chimes had started to play at 5:15 and were still at it. They started with the America and then the Marseillaise, then they continued to play at intervals all the morning. I went down as far as Cherry Street to buy a paper, and then hurried home to breakfast. Papa was just putting out his flag. All during breakfast, the bells blew, whistles rang, trains going by tooted, and there was a perfect bedlam of noise. We heard constantly interrupting by automobiles that would go by the head of the street, honking and crowded with people who yelled lustily. At 6:45, we had the first parade of the day. A dozen children with flags and drums marched by. Not wishing to miss any of the fun, I had decided to go down, and she goes on for 7 more pages talking about her great day, November 11th, 1918, at the age of 17. Dorothy Smith, by the way, lives in Florida. She's 91 years old. 2 years later, they put up the World War I monument on Waltham Common and listed all the men who participated in the war from Waltham. This was the parade that went on at that time. And every 4th of July or November 11th, 1918, they would have a memorial at the World War I monument at Central Square, Waltham. Here it is again, the World War monument with the Mercantile building in the background. Both are gone. On the right is the last, there's still one person remaining, 94-year-old Leo Stankard on the right. He was in Company F when they were training at Bicycle Park on Camp Banks in 1917. And there he is, healthy as anything, at 94 on Waltham Common, Leo Stankard. And the fellow on the left is a Congressional Medal of Honor winner from Weston. There's also an honor roll up at the Bleachery area of Waltham for those men from the Bleachery who fought during the war. Now, after World War I, once again, Company F National Guard reorganized, and they reorganized under this captain here, Captain Joseph T. Lawless, who was a sharpshooter. And his goal was to train his men in the 1920s and 30s to become real good sharpshooters from Company F of Waltham, Mass. As a matter of fact, Joseph T. Lawless won the gold, what do they call it, the gold, anyway, the Olympic gold medal in 1920. But there is troops. He trained them to be expert rifle shooters during the 20s and 30s. Unfortunately, he passes away in 1923, but his legacy is carried on by some great men such as Joe Ciano on the left there, Ray LaRossi, Carl Patterson, Lieutenant Elmer Mitchell, John Cullen, John Witham, Carl O. Coleman. And every year they'd go 2 weeks camping and training, Camp Edwards. Because, well, they didn't know at the time, but on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and a year later, the headlines said this: U.S. declares war on Japan. And once again, the United States called on Company F, the Waltham National Guard, to mobilize. They federalize them, and they send them overseas. And their leading sergeant was Lenny Dodge, Sergeant Lenny Dodge. And he was a real great shooter. He won a lot of medals during the 30s. And all those medals were later donated to the Waltham Museum, and they are on exhibit at the Waltham Museum, as you see here. But anyway, the Company F participated directly in the war, World War II. To be more specific, on January 23rd, 1942, Company F of Waltham left New York for Melbourne, Australia, as part of the large Task Force 6814. They arrived in Melbourne on February 26, 1942, and then went to New Caledonia on March 12, 1942. At New Caledonia, Company F and 182nd Infantry combined with the 164th Infantry to help form the 23rd Infantry Division known as the Americal Division. On August 2nd, 1942, the U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal as the beginning of America's offense against the Japanese. On October 13, 1942, the Marines were supported by Company F and the Americal Division. After some of the war's worst fighting, Guadalcanal was taken from the Japanese. During the next 3 years, the Americal Division helped push the Japanese back. On December 25, 1943, it was Bougainville and the Solomon Islands. They moved to Hollandia in New Guinea, and then to Leyte in the Philippines, and on January 25, 1945, it was Leyte. Finally, it was Yokohama, Japan itself, after the surrender of Japan on August 14, 1945. The men of Company F returned to America at Seattle, Washington on December 12, 1945, concluding another historical chapter in the history of Company F of Waltham. And that's the route they took, as I just explained. This was the insignia. When they were mobilized, they were put under the 23rd Infantry Division, the Americal Division. And like other wars, it wasn't just the National Guard or the volunteer militia. People came from all walks of life. Here's a sailor who came, I believe his name is Giuliano. He came from the corner of Noonan Street and Browns Avenue. That's where this picture was taken, saying goodbye to his girlfriend. They even came from Nippermar's baseball team. This is Nippermar's 1928 City Club team, and if you notice that man second on the left sitting with his visor up, that was Edmund Thibault, and he was killed in the Battle of Bulge in Germany in 1944, but he played on Nipper's first baseball team. And there were many, many others. I can't mention them all. This sailor from Waltham was on PT boats at the beginning of the war, a very dangerous mission in 1940s too. Now all the families, those who had men in the service, would have this banner hanging in their window. This particular banner shows that 3 persons from this family were in World War II. And if it was unfortunately, if it was a Gold Star, the person would have been killed in action. There was some large groups in Waltham. In other words, there was in one family, the William Bardsley family of Waltham. He, by the way, was a Bronze Star winner. There were 8 from his family in the service during World War II. He had 7 brothers in uniform. The Dion family, there were 6 from the Dion family, including a Navy nurse, Maria. And that's what it was like during World War II. Now, industry also played a part in the war. For instance, Raytheon Company moved from Cambridge. There they are in Cambridge. And they moved to Waltham in 1934, and they took over the old button factory in Waltham. Of course, they were making tubes, radial tubes for radios. But they also made a very important tube for the war effort, the magnetron tube, for radar. And if it wasn't for that, the war would have been a lot longer, because by Raytheon perfecting radar, it gave the Allies a hand up on the Germans and the Japanese, and helped remarkably to win World War II. And we should thank this man right here, Percy Spencer, for designing this sophisticated magnetron tube at Raytheon in Waltham. Now, this building is the old sawtooth plant where the Mets made their automobiles in 1914. It was where they made the Hadley Page airplane in 1918. But during World War II, it was used by the Army quartermasters as a supply depot. And all the prisoners coming back, prisoners were being sent back from Europe. All the German, Italian prisoners worked in this Army quartermaster depot, which is now owned by Raytheon. The German prisoners worked up in the farms in North Waltham, the Casella farms, the Kennedy piggeries, and so forth. The Waltham Watch Company did their part. They made time fuses clocks, of course, for tanks and aircraft, and the regular watches for military use. The home front did their part. On the right is Mayor Arthur Hanson, and on the left is Edward Noonan, who was head of civil defense in Waltham. They're at Prospect Hill Tower, looking for enemy aircraft in the early 1940s. Shortly after, Arthur Hanson would die on Waltham Common in 1942 during a barn rally. Well, anyway, the war ends on August 14, 1945. And this was the great headline in the Waltham News Tribune at that time. Now, from Waltham, 5,165 men participated in the armed forces in World War II. 140 of them were killed while defeating the aggressor, including the two Rizzo brothers at 47 Willow Street were killed in action. Sergeant Rosario at Peleliu and Private Jerome in Germany. Cousins were killed, including Private William Stanton and his cousin Sergeant First Class Andrew Stanton. Marine Sergeant Arthur Shaughnessy was killed in the Pacific. He was the hockey star of Waltham High. And his cousin Raymond Shaughnessy was killed. When Sergeant Lester Patterson was killed in action, his wife Louise joined the WACs. Silver Star heroes who gave their lives include First Lieutenant William Duane at Iwo Jima, who took part in many South Pacific invasions and was outstanding on Saipan. Technical Sergeant Charles E. McCulloch, who starred in action in Germany. Lieutenant Maxwell Stone, also an Air Medal winner, who fought Jap airmen during the sneak attack at the Philippines. And Corporal John Watson, who rescued wounded under fire in Sicily. We can't mention them all. Time doesn't allow it, but we do want to mention a few. There was a Lieutenant Bernard Rush, who was decorated with both the Legion of Merit and the Silver Star for inspiring his men to oppose fierce Nazi attack in Tunisia. And then there was C.Y. Francis Malloy, who awarded the Legion of Merit for outstanding service. Finally, we do have to mention that Sergeant Anderson won the Distinguished Flying Cross for downing two Luftwaffe airplanes during action in Europe. And there was also a fellow we knew, Carmen Melito of Felton Street, who was in bomber raids over the Pulaski oil fields in Russia. But anyway, the men came back from the wars. They did various things. James Fahey from the Montpelier wrote Pacific War Diary. Got to see all the presidents, Ford, Dick Nixon, Kennedy, and Johnson. Joe Lazaro, who was wounded at Anzio in Italy, came back and became the greatest blind golfer in America's history, and he wrote this book, The Right Touch. Here he's shown with Bob Hope. This is Joe Lazaro, wounded at Anzio in 1944. Dr. Albert Perner wrote this book, The Glider Gladiators, because he was in gliders during World War II in the Normandy invasion. Very dangerous occupation, and he recently retired from the school committee. But once again, there were other people who wrote books. We can't mention them all. Once again, Company F was reorganized, as you see the flag, the 182nd Infantry, between 1945 and 1950. But another war occurred, the Korean War occurred, and once again, men went off to fight the Korean War. We can name a few. We knew a Raymond Crane from Waltham, who saw action in the front lines of Korea. He recently passed away. There was Bobby Thompson, who also did action in the front lines. And there was a Bob Dakin killed. He played basketball on the 48 basketball team during the Korean War. But then the Vietnam War occurred, and this graduate from Waltham High School, 1935, was Franklin M. Davis. And he was the second major general in Waltham's history. As you remember, Nathaniel P. Banks was the first general, Major General, and Franklin Davis was the second general. Unfortunately, he's passed away in 60, later on in the 70s, but what was unfortunate, his son was killed in Vietnam. It was a sad occurrence. Also killed was a neighbor of mine named Wilfred Burgess. He was one of the first Waltham men killed in 1963 in Vietnam. His father, Zeno Burgess, was in World War I, and he was on that World War I monument. So we can't mention them all. Time doesn't allow it. We do know another person who saw a lot of action, Robert Valoran, was in the Marines during the Vietnam War, and his nephew, Mark Valoran, was in Desert Storm this past year. Saw action over there in Kuwait. But Raytheon continued its ways, making sophisticated war machinery. There's a group of them, Omar Bradley, Percy Spencer on the right. They make the Hawk missile. They made Sparrow 3 missile, air-to-air missiles, and of course they made the Patriot missile, which was instrumental in winning Desert Storm this past year. This is the awards, medals given to various men for various duties during all these wars. And the top ones are the Congressional Medal of Honors. And the final picture is a memorial ceremony at Mount Feek Cemetery for war dead from past wars. And we're sort of like, at this time in this last picture, to join together with all the men of all past wars, to salute them for what they have done in preserving our liberty and freedom in America, and say, well done. We regret those that we have forgotten to mention, but we say well done to all of them. We salute you, and we'll always remember you and repeat your history to future generations. This concludes the military history of Waltham. I want to thank you very much, and good day, ladies and gentlemen.